we go. Okay. Okay, so hopefully most of you have heard at some point about CARES and Local Energy Scotland. For those that are not so aware about who we are and what we do, this is just a very quick introduction to CARES to start off, and then I'll hand over to Tom Black from Foundation Scotland to take us through the main part of today's session. So first of all, CARES is the Scottish Government's Community and Renewable Energy Scheme. It's managed by Local Energy Scotland, who's a consortium of organisations, and it's here to help local communities to develop and partner in and benefit from renewable energy projects that use their local resources. CARES support covers 4 main pillars, which you can see here on the slide. And helping communities to maximise the impact from community benefits is one of those. So that's one of our key aims of CARES. And our support for communities accessing or looking to access community benefits is pretty extensive. You can speak to one of our development officers, and we can also draw on specialist support from Foundation Scotland as well. We've got a wide range of resources available, which you can find on our website. In terms of good governance, our topic for today, you can find out more by looking at the Toolkit module and the good practice principles as well, the Scottish Government's document. And if you need more support, then you can also use our framework of contractors. We've got a framework of contractors for community engagement, and one of those threads is for facilitating consensus on community fund governance and strategy. That's on our website under the Local Energy Marketplace, so do take a look if that would be useful to you. We've also got funding available. We've got enablement grants of up to 25,000 available to support. And to do this, to bring on those consultants or to develop a community action plan. And we also have an online community benefits register as well, which helps us track community benefits and what the current trends are. If you are one of those communities that are involved in community benefit funds, we'd be very grateful if you'd update your project records. It's always really helpful to get live case studies and new examples on the site. And if you have any further questions about CARES support, then do feel free to get in touch with the team. I'm going to hand over to Tom Black now for the main part of today's session, which is delving into the detail of getting the governance of community benefit funds right. But feel free as we go along to type questions into the chat, and we'll try and pick them up as we go. And there'll also be a Q&A session at the end. So I'll just stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see Tom's now.
Hello folks, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. I just wondered before we get started, we've 2 further folk have joined us, Callum Watkins and Graham Hilditch. Wonder if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves briefly and what your interest is in community benefit funds. Sorry, and also to raise awareness of the Community Benefit Toolkit produced for CARES by Foundation Scotland, and talk through the other support available through CARES, some of which Laura has just done. A little bit about us. We're a registered charity, an independent organisation, not part of the government. We have about 13 years experience in setting up and administering community benefit funds from largely, not solely, but largely from renewable energy projects. We currently support around, well, over 60, I think it was 63, maybe 64 at last count, community benefit funds as a third party fund manager and administrator. And we have a team of around, I think we've got 14 or 15 people in the communities team, all of whom have a background in both community work and fund management, and it's a marrying of two quite different but linked skill sets. We manage or administer about 1/3 of all community benefit funds in Scotland. In terms of value of funds, it's about £5 or £6 million per year going out the door to good causes and great projects, impactful projects, hopefully. We're working with over 300 communities across Scotland. And as Laura said, we are a subcontractor to CARES, so we provide advice to CARES on community benefit matters. We produce a number of case studies which are available on the CARES website. We produced a toolkit which we'll be talking through parts of tonight, and we run training and webinars like this one. We were also supported the populating of the community benefit register that Laura mentioned there, and worked with CARES to develop the framework of contractors in community engagement, which she also mentioned. It's best to start with definitions. What are we here to talk about? By community benefit package, which is the kind of language that the Scottish Government is using these days. By community benefit package, we mean monetary payments, which may be one-off, but more commonly are annual, and or other gifts, so in-kind contributions linked to a development in the locality. These are to be used for the benefit of a local community, and usually we're talking about a community of place, geographical community. Development itself may be commercially owned, fully commercially owned. It may have shared ownership element, which is obviously like Clashgower is going to hopefully have, or it may be wholly community owned. So for example, Carol's organisation, Awesome Energy Dalriada, wholly community owned renewable hydro project, to be specific. So what's different about these funds, these community benefit funds? They're pretty different from a lot of conventional funding in different ways. And here's how they might look or feel slightly different. Community benefit funds come from a private source, usually private sector source, or it might be a community source, but they're not taxpayer money. They're not public monies in that sense, not taxpayer or lottery players' money. It's from a private source. So there's a bit more freedom around them. But on the other hand, they very much feel like public money in terms of how people expect them to be managed, in terms of the standards around things like accountability and transparency that people would expect, certainly in the local community that's to benefit from these packages. They expect them to be managed in many ways like public funds. So there's a bit of flexibility there, but on the other hand, there's governance standards required. Community can design the package to meet its own priorities rather than somebody else's, perhaps, for example, national government or whatever. Decision making can happen locally and can be informed by local knowledge. Process can be changed around to best fit the local context and needs, and that includes timescales. Impact must be seen and felt because people will be, as I said, people consider these to be their funds in the local area and want to see the difference that's being made. So I'm not saying that top-down or conventional funds always feel like the column on the left-hand side, but they can do. So it's just a bit of context there. Community benefit funds ultimately are there to support the donors or providing them because they can want to support the creation of vibrant and sustainable communities, whether that means supporting heritage projects, events, arts projects, gatherings, people coming together, social side of the community, whether it means supporting jobs and apprenticeships, employment opportunities, training, whether it means supporting community facilities, village halls and so on. We've got a community-owned cinema there at the bottom left, whether it means supporting vital services in the community, and of course public realm improvements, green space, play parks and the like. So to try and support those involved in community benefit funds, to ensure that impact in the slide before actually happens, CARES has commissioned Community Benefit Toolkit, and Foundation Scotland wrote that. The desire was to support good practice in the setup and delivery of community benefit funds. The toolkit aligns with the Scottish Government's good practice principles for onshore renewables. And the language is around community benefit packages, not just funds, although usually there will be a fund, an annual fund associated, but other things may be there as well, in-kind contributions and so on and so forth. The toolkit recognises that no one size fits all. There's no one size fits all in terms of the approach that can be taken. Local context is absolutely key. We have a saying in Foundation Scotland in the team, context is king, and it's absolutely true. There isn't one size fits all, especially when it comes to the structure and the governance arrangements. But there are some common stages and some common principles. The toolkit is modular, so it's not there, definitely not there to be read from start to finish. It is there to be dipped in and out of depending on where you and your community are on that journey. There's a number of sample documents, templates and annexes for further information. That's the web link for the toolkit. The toolkit's organised, as I said, it's modular, it's organised into stages. So the first stage is really about the importance of understanding community context and what we mean by that, what ideally needs to be understood by those involved in setting up and managing community benefit funds. The second stage is really about securing the package from the developer, and there's some template material there. There's a template agreement, for example, between the developer and the community that might be of use. The next stage is around ensuring that the fund will deliver impact and covers things like creating a community action plan and feeding that into the strategy for the fund and what it will support. Creating a lasting legacy, it's called. That's kind of Scottish Government kind of parlance. The next stage is getting the governance right, which we'll be largely focusing on. And final stage is about kind of closing the loop in terms of that cyclical management of the fund. You need to monitor, evaluate and report, and then kind of revise the fund perhaps if need be. We'll touch a bit on that as well, hopefully today if there's time, because governance, that obviously is a key part of governance. There's an initial module, which is just an overview and introduction, which you may find useful. That's how the toolkit looks on the Local Energy Scotland /CARES website. Various links, sets out the key kind of points or objectives for each learning objectives for each module, and links to sample documents and annexes. So moving on to governance now. Yeah, I thought this was an apt quote from the Spider-Man movie, Uncle Ben. With great power comes great responsibility. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, there's this money that's quite flexible and brings a great opportunity for the communities involved. But there's obviously a clear responsibility to make sure it's managed well and delivers impact. What do we mean by good governance? Taking this from the Governance Pro website, I think it covers everything that most folk would expect to see in a situation where there is good governance. It's participatory, involves the key stakeholders, those who are impacted by decisions. It's consensus oriented. It's accountable. We'll come on to definitions of accountability and how we make sure that accountability is built into governance structures for community benefit funds. We'll do that later on. It's transparent. That means it's obvious or clear why decisions are made and on what basis. It's responsive. It responds to feedback from those who are affected. It's effective and efficient, avoids duplication of effort as far as possible, makes best use of resources. It's equitable and inclusive, not just feeding existing power structures, but trying to make sure that all those who have a stake can benefit from the activities of the organisation or the fund. And of course, it follows the rule of law, very important. Failure to maintain good governance standards can lead to inefficiency and duplication of effort, missing opportunities, they're not seen, or they're seen but not capitalised on, mission drift, so going off and focusing on things that weren't the raison d'etre for the organisation or the group involved. can of course lead to reputational issues. That does happen with community benefit funds, the kind of chat, the gossip, the tittle tattle out there in the community about what is or isn't being delivered with these funds and why certain decisions are being made and all the rest of it. And if you don't have good information out there in the community about the basis for your decision making, that will begin to impact. It can also obviously lead to legal or financial difficulties. That's obvious, I think, I hope. So putting in place the right processes and practice at the outset is what is the best way to avoid these problems. Having clear processes. So the module in the toolkit titled Getting the Governance Right covers these aspects. There's there's information on definitions and key principles underpinning good governance, with not the ones I've just been through, by the way, with particular regard to community benefit funds. This it sets out some practical considerations again in relation to community benefit funds. Goes on to outline the common legal structures involved and what the different considerations, pros and cons, factors are involved in choosing those structures. Talks about procedures for setting up and running the decision-making group. That's the group that might be involved in decision-making around how the fund is structured and the fund strategy, but certainly the group that is involved in making decisions over spend, where the money goes. And it goes on to talk about administration, what needs to be considered, and different options for in terms of how you bring in the administration resource and how you deliver that. There's an annex called Governance Structures, goes into a lot more detail on the legal structures piece that I mentioned there. A related but separate module is worth looking at too, the Monitor, Evaluate and Report one. And there's also an annex on how to develop a fund strategy. It gives a lot more detail on that. They're all relevant sections of the toolkit to look at as well in this area. So some of the key principles that it sets out, the toolkit sets out around governance, are that communities should have a clear role in decision making. This is something we've found over the years. Whenever communities are consulted on how their community benefit fund will be set up, they've all voiced a clear desire to have a role in decision making around how the money is used, what it's for, where it goes, and that can be done in different ways. The structure for the community benefit fund, as far as is possible, needs to be endorsed by the local community. So through consultations and so on, working with key stakeholders ideally, building consensus. Will it be a panel? Will there be an education and training element to the fund? These are just examples. Who will be able to apply? How will money be made available? Will it be through open grant making? Will there be something else more targeted? What's appropriate again to local context? Useful as well to keep it flexible and not tie the fund up in too many knots. This is kind of, you know, as I said, unrestricted money. There's not so much red tape around it. Those donating the funds, they do obviously want to know that there's been impact from the spend, and they want some information on that. They want to be able to use some of that information in their own PR and impact stories, understandably. But beyond that, and obviously in the agreement that governs the community benefit fund, there will be some restrictions in there, but it's usually a lot less than there are around public money. You may need to change the arrangements for how the community benefit fund's governed over time, as, for example, the capacity of the community to manage the fund itself may develop, or maybe needs. There always is changing needs, opportunities, aspirations in communities. Communities are dynamic, so things may change over time in terms of what they need from the fund. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Ideally, the governance will be inclusive of diverse interests, perspectives and experience. That doesn't mean you need to have a committee of 50 people. That's unmanageable in terms of who's making decisions over spend, but it does mean that there needs to be regular check-ins with the wider community, different parts of the community, including those who don't usually have a voice, just to check in that the fund is reaching where it needs to reach. Another principle is that it's normally, and again context is important here, but it's normally a good idea to separate decision making around where the money goes from bodies that are actually going to be delivering projects with the money for some obvious reasons, but I'll come on to that later on. And there should be a governance document for the group that is making decisions over the fund. If it's a company, that will obviously be the memorandum and articles, and so on and so forth. But if it's an informal group, and we have many of those involved in decision making on funds we manage, like a panel, informal panel, it'll be something a bit different. We use terms of reference. There needs to be a governance document that clearly sets out the roles and responsibilities, the procedures for example, conflicts of interest, for decision making, for chairing, and how people come on and off the group. So you've got healthy kind of rotation and retiral. So that's some of the key principles. When setting up the fund, these are the kinds of things that will impact on how you set up the fund. Has the renewable energy business or the organisation donating the funds got a preference for how it's set up? Have they prescribed or required anything in particular? What might the costs be involved in different governance models? What is the area of benefit? By that we mean what's been decided as the community that will benefit from the funding, and what does it cover? What area does it cover? In Scotland, it's pretty common. It's not uniformly so, but it's pretty common that the area of benefit will be defined by community council area as the most local level of governance, or most local kind of well-recognised administrative area. Is often made up of community council areas. So what is that area, and what are the preferences of the different groups within those areas? Are there other existing community benefit funds that are being delivered in the area, and how are they set up? And what's the pipeline of further funds that might be coming in? So it's worth bearing in mind, often in for example, very windy areas, those communities may have a plethora of community benefit funds coming in, and it might just be, too much for them to manage through different structures for each fund. So is there a possibility to streamline this, bring them all together under one governance roof? We've done that with a few communities. For example, Old Luce in Galloway receives 9 different community benefit funds from 8 different wind farm developers, and they came to us asking if we could help them streamline how this is managed. Obviously, there still has to be reporting to each donor, but as far as applicants to the grant making programme go, there's one form to apply, there's one form for monitoring. As far as the decision making goes, there's one panel. They receive updates on all the different funds available under those different strands, but there's one panel making decisions. So that's something else to consider, whether that kind of thing makes sense. That's just one example of a setup as well. Is there if it's a brand new community benefit fund, is there an existing community body that might be well placed to administer the fund or to manage the fund? And are they set up correctly in terms of their governing document, for example? And do they have the right skills on board? Which leads me on to the next point. Skills and time required in governing a fund can be considerable, so they need to be considered as well. And where those skills and time are, what's being required of the community, because often this will be local volunteers. So how do we make it manageable for them? Do you need to bring in professional support? How's that going to be paid for? So on and so forth. Risk management is another key consideration in setting up community benefit funds. So how is that fund managed? Is the organisation that's going to be involved in managing it also managing other projects that have risk attached to them? Is it managed separately from those in terms of the kind of corporate wrapper? How are you going to make sure there's public benefit, and how are you going to try and avoid as far as possible private gain, assuming that is the aim of those donating the fund, is for public benefit to be derived from the fund and not private gain. But it very much depends what they want to do. If it's going to be a charitable fund, that will be a cornerstone of how the money is allocated, given out. What can you set up in the time scale that's required, and where's that pressure coming from? And finally, do you want the organisation governing the fund to have charitable status? There are clear benefits to that. One of those being that it's clear to the wider public and those involved that anything funded must be charitable nature, and therefore will have that public benefit. But on the other hand, are there limitations there? We haven't found that ourselves, that we've not found there's been too many limitations around funding charitable activities. We've been able to fund almost everything that communities have wished to be funded, again, as long as there's clear public benefit. Right, we're going to have a little breakout here and give you a break from my voice. I've got a little table here that looks at governance and how does good governance look or feel in community benefit funds at its very worst and at its very best. So if it was awful and it was great. So you might have a situation where there's low levels of accountability, there's gatekeepers who aren't enabling access to the fund, using their positions of power or authority or whatever to do so. Or you might have broad local involvement in fund design and spend through different mechanisms. We'll come on to some of that. At its worst, you might have short-term piecemeal approach rather than some kind of strategic approach that might be ideally based on a consultation that was mentioned earlier from Fee there, in terms of listening to people and consulting and finding out what the community or communities' aspirations are for their area for the long term. A good well-managed community benefit fund benefits and connects a range of different interests. It's not territorial. It's flexible in terms of what it can fund, and it evolves with local needs as they change, local needs and opportunities. It responds to opportunity and unlocks ambition. Doesn't look for reasons not to fund. There's transparency around the criteria for getting hold of funding. There's regular reporting on where the money's gone. There's tangible impact. It's socially just, doesn't reinforce existing inequalities and groups and cliques and who has access to the power and money and so on. And it's aligned with other initiatives, unlocks partnerships and other money. Now that might be European funding, it might be Scottish Government funding, it might be lottery funding, it might be other local funds, local authority and so on and so forth. So that's kind of just sketching out how it might look or feel. When you're looking at the structure for setting up your community benefit fund, here are some options. You could have a community company. It's usually a company limited by guarantees. The correct structure there. It's very clear where control and ownership lies. It's very clear how it's not for private profit. And we support, in Foundation Scotland, we support several community companies that are set up for this purpose. It could be a SCIO, which again is an incorporated body but with charitable status. SCIO, sorry, for our Irish colleagues, is Scottish Community Incorporated, sorry, Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation. It's a legal structure that was set up to bring together company status and charitable status in one form. Might be that the community council is the structure. We do support community councils to make decisions over spend. That's usually more likely the case where the amount of money involved is small. So there's an existing organisation. There are some challenges and limitations involved there, and this is all set out, by the way, in Annex 6 of the Toolkit. So if I miss anything or you've got questions, by all means ask those just now, but you can go to that Annex 6 governance structures, sets out in detail what we consider to be the key kind of considerations, I suppose, around using these different structures. Another type of unincorporated association, that's possible as well, but just obviously be aware of issues around limitation on liability. You might use a specialist third party, Foundation Scotland, for example. Other providers are available, and they might hold the fund on behalf of the community. And under that scenario, there has to be a clear binding agreement that sets out exactly what the fund's to be used for what purposes, and which community, and that community only. And that organisation might support the administration as well. It might be that the donor, the renewable energy business who's donating the fund, says, well, you know, we're going to hold the fund and administer it. And that's certainly the case in some scenarios in Scotland. So that's possible as well. Or you might use an advisory panel model. Now, the advisory panel model really only works in conjunction with the two above it, where you've got the specialist third party or you've got the renewable energy business doing the administration and holding the funds. Because the advisory panel is an informal group. It's not incorporated and it's not set up therefore to hold funds. It is a panel of volunteers who advise the third party or the renewable energy business on where they want the money to go. And we use that structure a lot. Useful, as I say, to look at Annex 6. There's also, to kind of bring this to life a bit, because I'm quite aware we're talking often in the abstract here and around principles and concepts and so on. To bring all this to life a bit, there's some case studies on the CARES website, a lot of which we've pulled together. There's others that involve funds we're not involved in, or talk about funds we're not involved in. But those case studies just sketch out how it's worked, how it's panned out in different communities based on their context. A lot of different ones there. So that's worth looking at. I mentioned earlier this thing about distributing separating the distributing versus the delivering. So that means that those involved in making decisions around spend from the fund should, generally speaking, be separate from those who are involved in actually delivering projects from the funding. And that isn't always the case. There are some contexts where it may be appropriate for the two to be combined, but it needs to be super clear governance and accountability and transparency there. But it might be the case that if a very small community with one major development trust or anchor organisation that's set up to do this, there might be a subgroup, you know, that is involved in deciding where the money goes or recommending where the money goes, and is a bit separate from the rest of the folk involved in delivering projects. That does work. We've got a few examples of that in Scotland. But generally speaking, we recommend separation of duties because otherwise you have increased risk of conflicts of interest, and of course they may be real or perceived, both just as tricky. You may have mission drift, so the organisation may be set up to deliver projects, but it ends up spending all its time and resources focused on administering a fund or distributing a fund. You might have risk to the fund from other activities, so if that organisation is set up to hold and run, manage community assets, land, buildings and so on and so forth, and they go under or are at threat of going under, is there a threat to the assets within the fund if it's not properly separated out? By separating them out, you've perhaps the opportunity to engage more people and spread the workload, perhaps depending on how populous the area is and what skills you've got to hand, and it just increases the number of checks and balances. So that's recommended. So the group that makes decisions over spend, what are their roles? Well, they have a governance role, and that's set out in agreements and is enabled by the decision-making structure, and ideally the governing document should have detail around the processes and procedures, for example, around meetings, around quorum, around how decisions are made. They have a role in determining the fund strategy. That's setting the local priorities, or clarifying the local priorities, ideally based on open and meaningful consultation, setting in place agreeing the application criteria, and deciding what are the best ways of making the money available based on where it needs to go for what purposes, and I'll come on to that a little bit in a moment. If a role,
okay. It's me.
hello, in the chat. Oh, right, we've got 4. Sorry, I didn't have my chat open. Okay. So we've got Gerard. Is there a recommended maximum rate for administration? What's too much or too little? Is that the cost of administration, I assume?
Yes.
It depends. Yes, okay, thanks. I mean, for us personally, AFS, Foundation Scotland, it depends on the workload that's involved. You know, people do phone up and say, what's your rate? And it totally depends. You might have a fund that runs an open grant making process once a year, and that a grant making process might see 3 or 4 applications. That is very different from a fund that runs bursaries for education and training, bursaries for individuals, 4 grant making rounds a year that receive 20 applications each, and has several different panels involved in running all the different fund strands. That's hugely different workload. So I'm afraid, and I'm not dodging the question, but I would say, certainly from our perspective, I'm sure from others, you'd have to size the job up, quite simply. Will the links be sent out? That's from Carol. Yeah, sure, we can circulate the links, certainly to the toolkit, and from the main toolkit link, you'll get to all of these. Sorry, I just see that Laura's answered that. Gerard, is there a difference between near neighbours to the project and the wider community? Who defines these parameters? Can individual householders benefit also, e.g. for soundproofing, insulation or educational bursaries? I can only speak about our experience at FS, obviously. We do sometimes get brought in where the area of benefit for the fund hasn't been determined. This is ultimately up to the donor, you know, the renewable energy project developer, and the communities to agree and decide on. We have facilitated some discussions around that, but it's really up to those communities to decide. There's some guidance in the Scottish Government's good practice principles on determining the areas of benefit. There is no scientific formula. There are, in some cases, local authorities have, certainly in Scotland, Highland, I think Highland has a formula that they use, which is as good as any, around, you know, proximity to the wind farm, location of turbines, zone of theoretical visibility and things like that. But ultimately it's up to the developer and the communities to decide. There can be problems arising if you draw the line too tight. If you've got a huge amount of money and you draw the line too tight, because nobody lives their lives by, you know, their neighbourhood or their community council area. And there are examples where, for instance, lines have been drawn very tight, huge amounts of money getting poured into and being stored up in small communities who regularly access neighbouring towns and service centres for work, leisure, pleasure, health care, shopping and all the rest of it, and those nearby towns see nothing and are declining. Meanwhile, all the fund has to be spent in this very small neighbouring community. So you do need to think about that. No magic bullet, I'm afraid, there, and it can get tense in terms of the discussions and negotiations. Okay, I'll just come back to the slide, focusing on the roles of the decision-making group. They have a role in distribution, including promoting the availability of the fund. This is under our model, promoting the availability of the fund, making award decisions, and checking in on project delivery and impact as they go along, as the projects are delivered. And finally, we think it's healthy to have a review, a periodic review at regular intervals, where information on fund impact and learning is brought together and is used to have a look at the strategy and decide, you know, is this still working? Is this still right for us? Do we still want to cap, you know, for example, grants at £20,000? You want to put it up to £30,000? Are we actually tackling the right priorities? Have the needs of the community changed significantly? Are we reaching individuals? Sorry, there was a point there from Gerard on individuals, and they can be funded. We for example, fund educational bursaries where there's a clear charitable benefit. trickier perhaps to fund the fitting out of people's homes because there's significant private gain there, but it can be done. We've supported. A neater way of doing that is to support a community group to do that work in partnership with, for example, in Scotland, we've got Home Energy Scotland, we've got Resource Efficient Scotland, we've got organisations like that that can support homeowners to do energy efficiency. So actually providing a grant to a community group to work with them and look at local needs and measures, we find that a neater way to go. But it all really depends on what rules and restrictions are put in around the fund by the fund donor. And finally, on the review piece, feeding back to the community is important. So that's the roles of the decision-making group. Now, a lot of the decision-making groups are made up of volunteers, in which case, you know, that's quite a responsibility or set of responsibilities they've got. So you need to think about resourcing and professional support perhaps in that scenario. In the toolkit, there is guidance. I'm not going to go through all these points. I'm just bringing to your attention, there is guidance on considerations around the composition of the decision-making group, around transparency in recruitment and appointment process, around ensuring regular rotation and retiral, keeping it fresh, making sure it's not a closed shop. There's a sample code of conduct. There's a link to that. I'll ping that up in a minute. Code of conduct, that's important stuff. They need to be inducted into a role. It needs to be clear what their role is and what support they have, and what the rules and procedures are around that, around decision making. You need to have a really clear conflicts of interest policy, and that's tricky, particularly in small rural communities. It can get tricky. You can end up within quorate meetings if everyone with an interest steps out. Other meeting procedures need to be clear. It needs to be clear whether or not those involved in the decision-making group as volunteers can claim expenses and how and for what. The group needs to communicate regularly with the wider community. We're a real fan of making sure that minutes are published online. So for example, the funds we're involved in, we publish the approved minutes of all our panels, pretty much, I think, all our panels online, so that folk can go in and see what decisions were made and how, by who. Little note on open award making meetings. Some folk regularly say, look, all these meetings around these decisions on spend, they should all be done in public meetings. Can't see why anything else should be done. Now it can work, but in the majority of cases we found there's problems with that. And so folk who are saying you must make awards in an open public meeting, I would just encourage them to go and try it, because that can get pretty tricky. It's important, I think, to protect those involved in decision making and protect those applying. It's difficult in an open meeting if somebody throws in a curveball and says, well, we applied for this, but actually we want to do that, or you've got it all wrong in the report you provided, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something else, and they throw in unverified or unverifiable statements about the project. You need to draw a clear line and say, right, we've taken all the information we can on this project, we're going to sit together in a closed room and make a decision on that. That's what I would say. There are cases where decision making does happen in public, for example, very small amounts of money like micro grants, that regularly happens in community council meetings and so on, but where the big money comes in, it can get pretty tricky. And also remember, these are volunteers often on the panels and so on. If they're making decisions and can air their views openly in a closed meeting, that's much better than having to make decisions in a public meeting where they might rub shoulders in the local shop with someone whose application they've turned down. That is just a bit much, I think, to ask volunteers. The decision-making group can bring in professional expertise as needed if they can source funds for that, and we would encourage that they conduct some periodic kind of review of their practice. There's quite a lot in that, and I'm sorry that we've got such little time available, but there's plenty more in the toolkit on each of these points, so do go and have a look, please. I think it's really important to establish the culture and working practice at the outset. What is the expected behaviour? What is the tone of the group? what does everybody in the group see as appropriate or inappropriate behaviour? Very tricky sometimes where folk are wearing multiple hats, if you know what I mean. Folk in communities often have multiple roles, and it's the busy people that put themselves forward for these roles. So it needs to be clear that they're on what basis they're appointed to the panel and on what basis they're making their decisions when they're on the panel. And ultimately, you want them to come together and work like a team. There's a picture of one of the panels we support up in Caithness, launching their fund. Mentioned some sample documents and templates. We've got the a template community benefit agreement. As I mentioned before, that's between the developer or fund donor and the community. We've got an example role description for panel members. So it's almost kind of like a job. It's a voluntary job, but you're being really, really clear about what's involved in the role and what's not involved in the role and what the expectations are. We've got an example conflicts of interest policy on there and an example code of conduct that folk and the panels where we support, they actually have to sign up to that. We also have a template terms of reference, so that's the overall governing document for the panel. They're all there for you to download and kind of fill in the blanks or tailor to your circumstances. I'm just looking in the chat now. Laura, you've just posted in about the private householders. There's some funds that do that. Do you want to say a bit more about that at all?
I think you'd already, or you're in the process of answering it as I was typing, so you probably answered most of that. But yes, just to note that there are some funds that do benefit private householders, and there are some funds that are held by developers, where the part of the community benefits package is a fund that goes to the community, and part of it is held by the developers, and they administer a sort of grant to some private households as, you know, a discount on their energy bills, for example, and things like that. So it can be quite a flexible package that's offered, and it's not necessarily always the full amount goes as a fund to a community organisation.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. How crucial, this is from Eugene, how crucial is detailed codification? How do you establish a balance between rules and flexibility / trust? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do think you need to be clear on the role and clear on the expectations, but ultimately it's the community's fund and they need to be able to take the decision and own the decision. I suppose, despite the fact that the funds are generally very flexible, but there's often a common, for example, set of exemptions set out in the fund agreement. So most developers will say, well, you can't support anti-renewable energy projects or campaigns from these funds. We don't want you to support statutory duties and offset taxpayer funds. We don't want you to fund promotion of religion or political parties. So some of that stuff's there, some kind of fundamentals, but so I think you need parameters. But for example, you know, within those bounds, and maybe it might be a charitable fund, there's another set of parameters, but within that you want to enable the group to make decisions. So if they suddenly say, look, you know, we want to set up a fund for educational bursaries, they can just press the button on that and say, you know, we want that to happen, so the fund reaches wider and further into the community. Hopefully that answers that to some extent. It's useful to have a fund strategy, and that fund strategy, so I've got this annoying pop-up. Here we go. Fund strategy should set out what the priorities are for the fund based on that consultation, who can apply and how they can apply, what can or cannot be funded, any other criteria you might like to bring in. So those who are familiar with, for example, European funds, you might want some horizontal criteria saying, you know, you've got to have considered how environmentally sustainable your project might be and designed it accordingly. You've got to have considered local procurement, you know, value for money policies notwithstanding. You know, you would probably still need to get the right amount of quotes into evidence value for money, but all things being equal, you might favour procurement from local providers and just creating that circular economy. Fund strategies should set out distribution methods, which we'll come on to, how often money will be available and go out the door, what the minimum and maximum award sizes might be, how success will be measured, monitoring and evaluation piece, and how reviews will take place and what they will cover and who will arrange that review, conduct that review, or be involved in it. I mentioned distribution methods there. Here's some of the ones that we are used to using. Open grant making. Most people are familiar with that. Many groups will have applied to open grant making programs from other sources, and quite often a fund launches with an open grant making program just to start getting money out the door. Annex 5 of the toolkit sets out in detail some of the considerations around setting up and delivering a grant program, and there's some links to templates and sample documents there, application forms, so on and so forth. Another option is micro grants. So that's something that we do where we give money to, like a block grant, to a local organisation like a community council, and they then onward disperse that, usually to individuals and informal groups, and only up to a certain amount where, you know, we're all comfortable with a certain amount of risk to charitable funds. So it might be like £500, up to £500 for those kind of informal groups and individuals. Education and training bursaries can be distributed to individuals directly. They're usually for a bit more. We do that directly under a number of funds. Participatory grant making, that is a bit like participatory budgeting, if anyone's heard of that, where basically projects get a chance to present, groups get a chance to present their projects in a public forum. Pre-COVID, that would have been in the village hall or the community centre, perhaps the town hall. It can now be done online. There's more evolving practice in Scotland around online participatory grant making, and local people get a chance to vote and decide which ones should get the money. Commissioning is another option where there's clearly a service that needs to be delivered that's lacking in the local area. You might think community transport, broadband provision, whatever it is, and that can be done directly rather than the panel waiting for an application to come in that may never come in to solve that issue. They might say, we need this sorted, let's go out to tender and see what we can get. Loans are repayable grants. A repayable grant basically means a zero interest loan. We've done that a few times in situations where the panel wanted to support a business. That might be a not-for-profit business or a for-profit business, and the final one isn't really a distribution method. It's actually, you know, if the money's not all being used immediately, could it be put away, invested for growing for the future? We have a significant endowment service, but that's another option for communities. Coming on to accountability and ensuring that, I'm aware of time now, so I'm going to race through these next few slides. This is accountability means a situation in which someone is responsible for things that happen and can give a satisfactory reason for them. So how do you ensure accountability in a community benefit scenario? You need to get feedback from those who've received the money. That's fundamental. You need to know how they spent the money and what the outcomes or differences that's produced are. And report regularly back to the donor business and to the community on what's been spent, what the results of that spend were, what's been learned, and indeed the governance of the organisation. Publish your annual accounts, ensure your regulatory compliance, whether that's with Companies House and or the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, and conduct regular fund reviews with the involvement of the local community in that review in some way. I think we're probably running out of time, so we won't be able to go through this module in detail, but the module on monitor, evaluate and report sets out the purposes of doing this, how to design a monitoring programme, asking a number of questions there around how often, what to ask for, how to deal with the data, making sure you're not over the top with your monitoring. Don't ask questions, don't ask for data that you're not going to use. Make sure it's in plain English and you're just collecting what you need to report back on. There's some further information in the module on evaluating whether or not the fund is delivering impact, and reporting how you might report, how often, to who, and there's some examples of fund reports in there, what you might include in a fund report as well. But there's some links to some sample documents. We're just coming towards the end now. Laura, do you want to talk through this one, or do you feel you already have?
Yeah, I think basically I covered all of this at the start, so it's just a nice reminder for everyone that Care Support is here to help you. So thank you for that. I think there are a couple of questions on the chat still to cover, so we can run through them and then open it out if anyone's got anything burning they want to say before 7 o'clock. So there was one from Jared. How are individual grants or bursaries affected by taxation?
Do you mean in terms of the individual being taxed, or, I mean, as a charitable organisation, yes. Sorry, the individual being taxed?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's up to their own, I mean, that depends on their own situation. Funds we manage are charitable, and we give them out for charitable purposes. We don't do detailed means testing, but we do ask them to present a picture of their need and financial situation. We take that on trust. We don't do detailed means testing for two reasons. One, it's incredibly onerous, and two, it's a barrier to people applying. It just puts people off, and there's maybe some stigmatization issues there. But in terms of taxation, it's up to them to declare whether or not they've got a grant. I don't know the details around how that works. If it's charitable, I assume it'd be tax-free. Would it be seen as income? I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one either. And then there was one from Colin. Can you have a split fund, i.e. one central fund, but allow other community councils that wish to distribute their own funds? I kind of replied to that, yes you can. There's quite a few examples of kind of both local and regional funds operating in the same area, but Tom, I don't know if you want to add any of your experience onto that as well.
Just to echo what you've said, Laura, and yeah, there are plenty of examples. Foundation Scotland again is involved in setting up and managing a number of funds like that with the central fund, but small other pots available for individual community areas or community council areas. So we've got a number of funds where we do that. So that's absolutely possible. Devil's just in the detail creating that architecture, but it's absolutely possible to split the fund up. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm going to stop recording now, and then if anyone wants